Hi Farhad,
Hi Aditya,
welcome back.
thanks.
Uh,
Nice of you to come here again.
Very
Thank you.
nice of you. In fact, I was about to say is that you've taken out time for our viewers and talk about a very important subject that, in some way or the other, affects every engineer who works on a session
Uh-huh.
or every musician who gives you a session or brings a session to the studio for mixing or editing or
Okay.
mastering. So please enlighten us with your experience
Well,
and
it's not enlightened, actually, it's a bit based on common sense. I am willing to bet this is possibly the most boring video ever on SudeepAudio. I'm going to talk about something I think that affects all of us as engineers, and that is sending out Pro Tools sessions in terms of session management. Now, I'm sorry, I'm talking about Pro Tools because as an engineer, that is what I use, but the same I'm sure can be applied to Logic, Cubase, anything, even if you're a musician sending it to another musician to work on, or a studio sending it to another studio, engineer sending it to another engineer, whichever way it is. Uh, I'd like to talk to you all about why I do what I do. Firstly, when you think about it, today every engineer seems to have a style. I can open up a session that's brought to me and more or less be able to tell you which studio it's come from and very possibly who's worked on it by just opening the session. So you have to understand that your session is a bit like your business card. You know, that this is how he records, this is how he labels, this is how neat it is, the IO setup, everything saved. And I think when you give your business card to someone, when it goes out of your hands, it's like your session speaks a lot about who you are as an engineer or as a studio, what work practices you follow. And that's why I want to talk a bit about this.
so please tell us more about session management.
Well, one of the first and most easily corrected mistakes we make as engineers, I think, when we're working on a session, not really necessarily just songs, even advertising projects. What happens is we just work on this assumption that for whatever reason we'll be the only people who will work on the project. So it's okay because you've recorded it, you know what parts are where, generally, I would assume.
Hmm.
But shit happens. Real life does not account for things happening. You might have done a perfect project, a perfect mix, and somebody wants some changes, agency wants changes, the record producer wants changes, the record company wants changes. Anything can happen, and you're not free the next day. What do you do? I mean, there's only a very limited amount of things you can do with unmixes or stems, right? They are given to the producer more out of a an emergency safety rather than to replace a session with. But ultimately, either you're going to be one day in a position where you're going to have to send your session out because they need the whole session open and you don't have time to do it, or you're going to get a session to do which someone else has done
Hmm.
and they didn't have time to finish it or changes are required. I often receive sessions from somewhere. They may be song sessions, it can be advertising sessions, and one of the first things that I notice and that ends up happening, in fact, very often I refuse very short sessions where they want to bring the whole session in from another studio. Because session interchange itself is a complicated thing. As it is already complicated because one is plugin compatibility. All studios don't have the same sets of plugins. So you're always wondering whether everything will open or not. Secondly, every studio has a different IO setup. Some have very complex IO setups, some keep it really simple, A1, A2, B1, B2 on a Yamaha with just a Pro Tools digital interface. Those are the easiest sessions to open. Now, what happens is I find in experience that I spend more time investigating the session to find out what is there, what is rooted to what, how it is mixed, because obviously I don't want to reinvent the whole wheel. If someone's come in for a small change, we want to change the singing, we want to change this VO. We had another take on that track, and you look at the session and it says audio 3 FVO duplicate 1.01-13. Now, what the hell does it tell you? I think it's very bad practice because it makes you look bad if you sent out a session like that. Not a very professional thing. It makes the next guy down the line who's going to be working on that session look bad, because obviously something that should have been a simple change which budgeted for maybe an hour of studio time now ends up taking 2 hours, 2.5 hours, because the other engineer's frantically looking for this take where nothing is marked. He doesn't know where it is, and the producer is obviously getting frustrated. So I'd like to point out a few things that I think all of us should try to accept as a practice that just makes life easier for all engineers, whether you're the guy receiving the session or you're the guy sending out the session. Firstly, good session management or getting a clean session starts actually whilst you're tracking. Now, I understand that you don't generally get luxury of time to sit and name takes and name tracks whilst you're tracking. Everyone is always in a rush. The voiceover is in a rush to get to the next recording. The producer is in a rush to do something. Someone else is in a rush. The music director is in a rush waiting to record his parts, and it becomes a little crazy because no well-planned day ever ends up being a well-planned day. They'll tell you the VO is coming in at 10 and the music director will come in at 12, and by 5 o'clock we are calling the singer, and everyone's lives get messed up. The VO comes late, the music director comes early, he wants to do something, the VO needs to get to the next session. Tracking itself is a very stressful process for most engineers, I'm sure. What I do to alleviate these problems we face is, if I know that we're going to get 3 voices in, I know we're going to do singing, I keep pre-labeled blank tracks ready. So yes, just like all of you do, I do just duplicate tracks. But whenever we finish tracking one voice, I ask for a minute before the second voice hops in, and I just quickly pull out all the takes, extra takes, consolidate them. If there are optional takes, I consolidate those and keep them on clearly labeled tracks. If you're doing a chorus or you got 9 different versions of the FEO, I'm sure you'll end up with duplicate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But you can always name them after the session is done or after the recording is done or when you have a break. It just makes life very simple for everyone.
Now, when it comes to music, which is not dubbing, but you have a guitarist in the studio, you have somebody who's with a keyboard or drum kit or whatever. At that point, how do you go about layering your tracks?
Let me tell you where it comes from first. I'm very old-fashioned in some ways, despite the fact that we end up using very cutting-edge gear. That's because I've cut my teeth with recording on analog systems. Because of the idiosyncrasies of the medium, as it were, of analog tape, there were certain things that we just did that became an unquestioned norm. Now, these are practices that genuinely have no bearing on a modern workstation, but a lot of us older guys end up doing it. For example, on analog tape, you used to always record the kick or the bass on track 1 because of the way the tape was packed. It could get crinkled on the edge and you would lose high frequencies on the edge tracks. So because of that, we used to always record sounds like the kick or the bass on the edge track and keep the last edge track, which would be track 16 or track 24, for time code. So as a result, you almost always started with the kick drum on track 1 and then you built up your drum group. And whether you were actually tracking live drums or you getting a multi-track dump from someone's drum machine, that is the practice we followed. You almost always ended up tracking your drums and bass, which is like the foundation of your sound, which is why today even when I get a session, the first thing I do is set up the tracks in the order I would mix it in. So it's like kick, snare, toms, hi-hat, your bass drum, basic drum kit, crashes, rides, then any other percussion. Then next layer would be grouping of Indian percussion. Again, in terms of frequency build-ups, from low frequency to high frequency. So it start with maybe like a duff, dumbek, mid frequency, tabla, dholak, then drop down to shaker, manjira, the high frequency stuff. After which we track the bass. And generally, when I'm mixing, bulk of my time is spent on these tracks. That's when I'm mixing really loud. Because I think your drums, percussion and bass lay the foundation of the way the song is. That's what drives the song. And everything else in the song generally is reacting to that combination. Your method might be different. I'm just trying to explain my madness to you. For me, it is very important to get a correct mix perspective of drums and bass because that's where I have come from. Generally, after that, I will organize the next layer, which will be pianos, EPs, organs, pads. If there are no pianos or the song is guitar driven, then there'll be a guitar group. And it will be also organized, acoustic, rhythm, plucks, 12 string, electric rhythm, electric plucks, lead guitar. And what I end up doing is then these will become groups. Okay, I color coordinate them also. I group them also. So as the mix progresses, if I want to adjust one versus another, it becomes very easy for me. Suddenly we feel like, okay, the drums have gone too loud. You can just pull down the drums. Okay, after we've added the guitars, the Indian percussion sounds not right. You can just lift because you've already attained a balance between them. So what ends up happening then is it is organized. If you send a session like that, whether you are tracking it or not, if you send a session like that to someone else, even to mix, I don't know about you, but personally, I find it a pleasure to receive a well-labeled, clean session. Because what I like I'd earlier said, when you magnify this to a music session with 90 tracks or 120 tracks, what ends up happening is you spend, if it's being sent to you to mix, you spend many hours wasting time trying to find what is where. You think you've got the guitar and you started work on the drums or something else, and suddenly you'll find one percussion track that wasn't labeled or right at the bottom. And it throws the workflow off because again you're back to looking at the drums and you're adjusting other drums to fit this new track into the thing. So it's best to look at it as a whole chunk. This is it. This is the drums, you're done. This is the Indian percussion, you're done. This is the bass, you're done. Now these three groups are the foundation of the sound. Now you can start adding the melodic parts of the sound. I'm not saying there's a right or wrong way to do it. I'm just explaining to you why I do it the way I do and why it makes it easy when you get a session that has been labeled like that. Very often what happens when you get a session is that it might just be a wave export from someone else's workstation. Someone's working on Nuendo. Musician has programmed it in Logic and sent it for mixing. And you will invariably end up sometimes with rightly labeled tracks, sometimes with tracks that are not correctly labeled, sometimes. But most important thing is you will end up with all the tracks in alphabetical order, and when you drag them into your workstation, they will pop up on the corresponding tracks in alphabetical order. So this is the first thing I do when I'm preparing a song for mixing, and it's a practice I follow even in the sessions that I track on. It is always organized, arranged, and kept so you open the session and you know exactly what is going where. Auxiliaries are labeled, reverbs are labeled, sends are labeled, returns are labeled, the master is labeled, and I just think that makes life so much easier. Whether I have to revisit the project after 1 year or you do it again day after tomorrow and you have to make a change on it. I think it's a very simple practice for everyone to follow, and it just makes everyone's life so much easier.
Right. I'm sure with your lovely inputs here, you've helped a lot of musicians
Well,
and engineers.
I certainly hope so. Like I
And
keep saying, it's a boring topic. It's something most of us don't like talking about, but I think it's something that's necessary to bring out there.
right.
And if you think about it a bit, I'm sure at some point every one of us have been the other guy, the one who's getting the nightmare session, and you open it and it's just crazy. There are alternate takes that are open, nothing has been hidden, labeled, everything is called audio 1, audio 13, track 15, and you just look at it and it's your worst nightmare come true, because you suddenly just know that this 1 hour change that you'd agreed to do is going to end up being 4 hours, 3 hours, and it ends up making you look like an idiot in front of the producer as an engineer. It can end up making the other guy who sent you the session look like an idiot too. And as engineers, we are all one brethren, I would like to think. So I think we should help each other in not looking like idiots.
No, I'm sure with your experience and views and your suggestions and ideas that you just shared with us, you have definitely made a lot of lives easier.
I hope so.
Thanks for sharing
Thanks,
your
Adi.
inputs. Thanks. Bye.